Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for attending this ISBAO Polaris Aero SafetyNet webinar series. Today, we are looking at FOQA and FDM to produce safety lessons learned. I am super excited for this presentation. I'm Catherine Hilst, the ISBAO Operations Manager. And before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping items for you all. With the number of attendees that we have all of the audience members on mute, but we do have a place for you to ask your questions. In your control panel, you will have a questions drop down, and feel free to submit any kind of question or comment you'd like there, and we will address those at the end of the presentation and discussion this morning for the panelists to answer. So this is, as I mentioned, about FOQA and flight data monitoring and how it provides objective measures of your aircraft flights. Leveraging this important information to identify trends, anomalies, and opportunities to address shortcomings is vital to flying as safely as possible and seeking continuous improvement. This webinar is going to give you some examples of the way that FOQA and flight data monitoring is helping their pilot groups improve, communicate, and address this important safety data point. From Polaris Aero, we have Steve Bruneau. He is the Vice President of Aviation Services at Polaris Aero and is responsible for expanding the company's suite of safety management solutions. Prior to joining Polaris, he was the Chief Operating Officer of Pulsar Informatics, delivering fatigue risk management systems to aviation organizations of all types, including their maintenance and ground handling departments. He has over 25 years of process consulting experience, helping organizations meet regulatory requirements or achieve new levels of performance. Steve has a BS in mechanical engineering, a master's in aerospace engineering, and has been a leader of 3 successful startup companies prior to joining Polaris. Jonathan Reeves is currently the Director of Aviation Safety for Sedgwick CMS, where he is also a captain on Gulfstream 7 and Gulfstream 280 aircraft. He earned a bachelor's degree in aerospace with a professional pilot emphasis 25 years ago and has served as a flight instructor, flown for a 135 cargo operator, flown for a 121 airline, and spent nearly 17 years as a corporate pilot. He has 15 years of experience in aviation safety leadership roles. And last but certainly not least is Eric Francis, the Manager of Safety for a Part 91 operator based in Oklahoma City that operates a Global 5000 and a Global 6000. In addition to his flying duties, he's responsible for overseeing the department's SMS, FOQA analysis, and training programs. And prior to his employment in Oklahoma City, Eric served as captain and check airman for Delta Private Jets based in Cincinnati, Ohio. He brings to his department 7 years of Part 135 experience in Learjet, Citations, and Challengers, as well as 10 years experience as a Part 141 senior flight instructor at Sporty's Academy in Batavia, Ohio. Thank you so much, Steve, Eric, and Jonathan, for being here. And Steve, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Catherine, and hello, everyone. Thanks for attending. As you can tell from the bios of today's guests joining me, bring a lot of experience to the table. And as we prepared for today's session, there's a lot of great talking points that you're going to hopefully take away from this and be able to bring back to your flight departments as you consider FDM or FOQA within your flight or operation as well. So what I want to do is frame out today's discussion. We're going to start by getting to know Eric and Jonathan's flight departments a little bit. That way, as they talk about some of the examples that we'll be discussing, you'll have the context of what it looks like in their flight department. But what I want to do before we get too much into the details of FOQA FDM is just sort of level set sort of the underlying fundamentals of SMS, so that when we start to talk about FOQA and FDM, we don't look at it as this sort of extra Herculean thing that's considerably different than what you probably already do as part of your SMS. You're going to hear a lot of the same themes throughout the talk today that in the end tie right back to the same fundamentals of a typical SMS. And that's, of course, by design, but oftentimes we get sort of enamored with all of the acronyms and we lose sight of the fact that it's really another form of the same thing, albeit a little bit different. Then we want to dive deeply into the phases of the FDM FOQA program as it is. And again, tie it back to your overall SMS, which hopefully many of you on the call already have. And in looking at those phases, we're going to talk about the policy of how you bring on your FDM FOQA data. How's it going to work? Who's going to see it? How's it going to be used? All those sort of things. Then we're going to get into the input that comes in. What are you looking at, and how is it consumed by the organization? Then we'll get into the analysis portion. We want to basically emphasize that the FOQA data is what has occurred, and the importance from a safety standpoint is converting that into why it happened. And then from that, of course, basically understanding the why it happened, be able to put in place risk controls and leverage those lessons learned to minimize reoccurrence of the same things, right? Ultimately, that's why we're doing these things. And then ultimately, from a safety assurance pillar around SMS, is being able to monitor, the process for effectiveness. Are the risk controls working as expected, or do we need to make continual enhancements? And then last but not least, how are we promoting this, right? How are we communicating these lessons learned and the successes that we hopefully are experiencing? It's very important. And then at the end, we'll just wrap up with some parting thoughts. Again, hopefully good takeaways that you can bring back to your flight department as you consider bringing on FOQA FDM to your program. So before get too deep into this, just quickly learn each of our flight departments. Let's start with Jonathan.
Hi, I'm Jonathan. I'm a captain with Sedgwick and our safety officer. I operate a Gulfstream 7 and a Gulfstream 280, and that's what our fleet consists of right now. So in December, we're going to switch to an all Gulfstream 7 fleet. We started monitoring FOQA data back in 2019, initially on the 280 and then on the Gulfstream 7. And as far as the QARs go, how the data is uploaded to GE, the G7 has a wireless QAR, so basically anytime it's on the ground with a Wi-Fi or cellular connection, it can upload if time allows. And then the 280 has a wired QAR.
All right, and Eric.
Hi, thanks for having me, Steve. And we operate Global 5000 and a Global 6000 out of Oklahoma City. That was a recent upgrade from Challenger 604. Our FOQA program started in 2018, and we do our readings when it gets back to home base. So none of our aircraft are wireless at the current time.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. So I think you can see here that these guys have been doing this for quite some time. So a lot of the things you'll hear about today are based on a lot of experience. So it'll be really good. Hopefully there'll be a lot of follow-up questions as well. All right, so let's, before we get too much into the details of how these guys are operating their FOQA program, let's start again with the fundamentals, because I think one of the really cool things that you're going to see in some of the talking points later on, again, is some fundamentals that just tie back to good old-fashioned SMS principles, right? So let's take a crack at some of those. Why are we doing this to begin with, right? At the end of the day, aviation has inherent risk. So this is another means of improving the likelihood of safe flying, right? It's another way to collect good safety insight about how airplanes are being flown so that you can learn valuable lessons to improve that. So again, this won't eliminate all risk, but it's another way to reduce risk. And I think it's important to think of it in that same context, right? And then another thing that I like to look at is, no matter what you're trying to improve, you need to measure something and then manage what you're measuring. And I think as you're going to see in today's presentation, there's a lot of things that are being measured by FOQA and FDM systems in general in a very objective way, which really gives you a really good leg up on being able to manage that. And again, you're going to see some examples of this today. So kind of wanted to lay that framework down because, again, I wanted to keep it simple without getting too mired in the minutia of the specifics. Let's talk a little bit about the fundamentals of SMS. And again, not to get too heavy into the SMS details, but looking at the four pillars, right? It's going to start with your safety policy. Those of you on the call who already have an SMS in place, you already have your safety policy. So as you bring on a FOQA FDM program, you might want to supplement that with, how is the FOQA going to be used in the same context? And you're going to hear Eric and Jonathan talk about that today. Then we're going to talk about safety risk management pillar, the way in which you're going to identify risks, analyze them, and come up with your risk controls. Again, same thing you do now when people submit safety reports of other types. Safety assurance, again, making sure that the risk controls that you have in place are working as intended. Again, you're going to hear that with the supplement of how it's being done on the FOQA side as just another example of the same safety assurance pillar principle. And then last but not least, the safety promotion angle, right? How are you communicating the lessons learned coming out of your FOQA program in the same way that you would communicate lessons learned from other safety reporting endeavors as well. So again, I'm putting this here not to, again, give you the typical SMS 101, but just to kind of serve that framework, because you're going to hear these 4 principles throughout today's conversation, just with a FOQA spin on it. So again, it's not completely different, it's just another form of. The other thing that I really like to point out, and for those of you who have heard my presentations in the past, I'm a huge believer in people, process, and technology. I think that whenever you have one leg of this stool not functioning up to par with the others, then it's really hard to get the results that you're expecting. So when you think about the people, certainly the gentlemen on today's call are super enthusiastic and motivated, but they go about their business in a way that really motivates their team as well and keeps their team engaged in the process. And you're going to hear that along the way. The process, right? How are we going to take this data and process it and so forth? And again, you're going to hear the examples from today's guests as well. That's important, right? Because they fly, both of these gentlemen, so that they got to do their flying duties plus take care of all these duties, and they need to keep this as effective as possible. And then last but not least, the technologies that they use to both collect the data off the QAR, process it, and then process it through their SMS, right? They want to use technology as much as possible because there is a lot of moving parts and you need to stay organized, and yet you need to also be able to peel back the onion and understand what the data is telling you. So to a great extent, again, you're going to see all 3 legs of these stools throughout today's discussion. So let's talk a little bit about the safety risk management process, because when you talk about FDM and FOQA data, it's another form of the input to the overall safety risk management process. So I'm going to start with just looking at all the typical forms of data that you see coming into your SMS. Obviously, you're going to have safety reporting coming in from your pilots through a traditional hazard reporting type method. You may have ASAP reports as well. You may have customers submitting reports to you through some means as well. Your safety officers and your staff may see interesting things on aggregated websites like ASIAS, or when they go off to training at various third-party providers. And then, of course, you now have FOQA data, which is objective data that's going to come into the mix as well. So in looking at this, what we really want to present here is that FOQA is just another form of data coming into your overall safety program. Now, that said, when that data comes in, you need to do something with it, right? And as you can see there in my red bullet there, if data is there and you don't do anything with it, then it's effectively useless, right? So to be able to take the time, like Jonathan and Eric do all the time, to then process that data, that's where the real knowledge is going to come, and the ability of your flight department to act on that data. So in our world, through the VOCUS program, we really look at taking that through what we call a root cause analysis process. We like to refer to it as the full safety story. The who, what, when, where, and why was going on and resulted in this particular event. So by understanding the details of what went into a particular event, it gives you a lot of input to be able to get into the right corrective action and risk controls. And of course, tracking and trending all this leads to sort of urgency, prioritization, and being able to do some SPIs, as you'll see in a minute. So when you think about safety processing, you get your input, you do your analysis, you come out with your quote unquote fix. What's important to safety in general is to take that quote unquote fix and be able to promote it and use it as a risk control, right? How are we going to avoid having the same outcome in the future? Well, in our world, we want to be able to program that into our pre-flight tools so that the next time we're about to take on a flight that has similar conditions, we can appropriately warn the crews about what kind of lessons learned have been experienced in the past. And you're going to hear some great examples today, right? So when you arm your pilots on future flights with this critical information, ideally you're flying as safely as possible. And then, of course, after your flight, you're going to have a debrief, and that could be yet another input to your safety program. So when you think about this flow chart, when it comes to safety information, processing information, and so forth, what you really end up with here is a closed loop system that, if done correctly, is a continual engine that powers the safety knowledge that you're aggregating within your flight department. And again, FOQA data is a vital piece of being able to do that well and effectively. So you're going to hear that today. So I wanted to put that context there because you're going to see that in today's discussion. Now, as I mentioned, the full safety story, or root cause analysis, is the important piece of what we're going to talk about today, because the FOQA FDM data is, again, just providing the outcomes or deviations, right? What happened? But we really need to get beyond that, right? And when you look at it, by way of example, what I mean by this, if you look at a chart like this and you see that there's been 4 long landings over some time frame, your immediate reaction is, oh, there's a trend with long landings. But unless you do a root cause analysis, you may not have realized that all 4 of these happened for completely unrelated factors. So there really wasn't a trend at all. So again, understanding what's behind everything is important. Another example of the same concept is the other way, when it doesn't look like you have a lot of things going on. But of the things that you do have going on, if you do a root cause analysis on these 4 examples, you may find that fatigue was an underlying contributor into all 4 of these events. So fatigue is really what you need to pay attention to. So the point of mentioning this in a very simplistic way is just to convey the idea that we want to take in data, but it's just as important that you then process it so you see what the data is actually telling you, because those causal factors are what could lead to the next problem. And that's what you need to get ahead of with your risk controls. So sort of in a cartoonish sort of flow chart, how does this look with FOQA? You're going to have your pilots reporting things into your SMS through the typical hazard reporting process, right? And then what you're going to be able to do, of course, here is then with the FOQA data, that's going to get lifted off the airplane, whether it's through the wireless QAR upon landing, or through the offload through the maintenance process, or other, as we'll talk about as well. But at the end of the day, both of these things are, again, reporting safety incidents into the safety world, right? And the difference, though, here is that the airplane is objective, where the personnel submission is subjective. But it's important to have both of those perspectives, as you're going to hear from Eric and Jonathan today, because when you get the what happened, your ability to really do and determine the why is going to be based on your investigation. So when you take that what happened and run it through your investigation of all the internal factors that could have been at play, as well as all the external factors that could have been at play, by having as much input as possible to this analysis, you're going to be able to boil out what were the root causes that led to this issue. And it's those root causes and the trends of these root causes that are going to lead you to be able to then put in place the appropriate risk controls. And again, those risk controls will be the things that you put at the front of all future flights to keep your pilots out of hot water in future endeavors. So again, that's sort of the process flow that we're going to get into quite a bit today. So, whoops, went too far. Let me go back here. So let me talk a little bit about the phases, and this is where the talking points from Eric and Jonathan are going to be super helpful for all of you. We're going to talk about the policies that each of them have in place for their program, get into the way they use their FOQA reports, their investigative processes, look at some risk control examples, some safety assurance examples, then ultimately the ways in which they promote that. And we're going to talk about that in the next couple of slides. So let's take a look first at the policy. And what's sort of, I'll call it the elephant in the room every time I talk to a flight department about FOQA is how open is the FOQA data to the rest of the team? Is it openly shared, or is it on the other spectrum in a max confidential kind of way? And we have clients that run the gamut from both ends of the spectrum. But today, let's talk a little bit about, we'll start with Jonathan.
So the way how we run at our flight department is we have a single gatekeeper, currently just a single gatekeeper, and I am the single gatekeeper. The way how our corporate structure is, or I don't have pilots that report to me because I'm not considered people management. I just manage the processes and the safety management system. So with that in mind, there's no jeopardy for the pilots to talk to me about the events. So as a JES culture, they can be candid with me and not be concerned about any management I guess taking well, the non-jeopardy part of it. So pilots don't have any fear about talking about the reports. With that, we redact the information unless the pilots want to share that it was their event, because the who of the safety report or of the FOQA report isn't really necessarily as important as the how, and then figuring out the why. Gotcha. And the how and why comes with a little bit of detective work from looking at the reports and talking to the pilots and figuring it out. And they're more open to do that, I think, in a non-jeopardy situation.
Excellent. How about you, Eric?
When we introduced our FOQA program, I was assigned to be the gatekeeper, and we wanted to make it very clear to our pilots that this wasn't a big brother situation where I'm watching every flight and I'm here to pick on you for making any type of mistakes. our purpose was to collect data to identify risks and either create a policy or some type of way of improving and being very proactive in our department about not making mistakes again or preventing future mistakes. So when I share information with the group, it's wiped of all identifying information. Again, I'm the gatekeeper, so I'm the only one that can figure out who was flying the flight. Obviously, you know, we've all had those situations in our careers where you're like, yes, I generated that memo. So the person usually knows the crew that did it. But with a small department like this, we're just focused on trying to identify the risk and trying to learn from it and keep moving forward. But we've also got a clause in our manual that says, you know, if somebody's out there, you know, playing Maverick, you know, it's going to show on the FOQA data, and it can't be ignored. So it's non-punitive in the general sense of how we use it, but it is being recorded long term.
Gotcha. Excellent. On the FOQA report side of things, Eric, maybe you can talk about the way in which you consume that data.
So our aircraft comes back to the hangar at least once a month, and when it does, we download the data, upload it to GE. GE processes the data, and that links directly with our Vocus SMS account. So when FOQA reports are generated, I get an email that says, hey, a new event has occurred. It prompts me to go into the SMS, and I can either archive the information as, oh, it's a nuisance, it doesn't really relate, or hey, I've seen this before, let's start monitoring, let's create a safety performance indicator to start looking at this. Or I can say, hey, somebody just filed a safety report about this. I can marry the two together and create a new issue that keeps it right in front of my face, and we can start analyzing what's going to happen next. I do get crews, you know, calling me and, hey, you know, we added the flaps right at the limit and got a gust right after we added them. So, you know, we rung the bell. So you're going to get a FOQA from me. So when that happens, I just say, please, can you just file a safety report, and we'll pair them up when it comes through and keep moving forward.
Gotcha. What about you, Jonathan?
So our Gulfstream 280 has to be manually downloaded or uploaded, rather, the data to GE. So we average 2 weeks in between uploads on the 280. I really feel the more frequent upload, the better. Crews, especially if you go to the same airport often and it's the same crew, if they had an event that they weren't aware of, then they wouldn't be able to recall out of 6 different landings to the same airport in similar weather conditions, one approach from the other to know, you know, one, who was flying it, or what the situation was if there was something that would have dinged on FOQA. So the guys are busy, so that's what we try to do, it more frequent than 2 weeks rather. The 500 rather, the Gulfstream 7 that we have is wireless, and it downloads pretty frequently, within a week usually, for each flight. However, when I go back and look at the data status, if it's been more than a week, we try to set up with our crews to where they'll be in a position where it can do the wireless download. So that usually they have to leave it either on power, ground power, or APU running for a longer time for the data to download, to be in a place where either wireless or cellular for the background.
Gotcha. And your point about the training your crew to do it themselves was interesting as well.
Yeah. So on the 280, it's like I said, you have to download it manually. It's a flash drive downloads, and then if we were to keep the 280, I would consider training a couple of our pilots to be data collectors. It doesn't take. You're not limited to the number of data collectors because it's ones and zeros, so they're not aware of the data. It just takes a thumb drive and a program on a computer to upload the data to GE. So I would consider training crew members for that. It doesn't take a whole lot of time, but if airplanes are on the road for a long time and you don't have an opportunity to do frequent downloads, I would go that route in addition to maintainers doing being a data collector.
Yeah, and Eric, where you guys do it once a month, have you found that there's been a memory lapse as you've tried to investigate, or has it been all right, just kind of because of the kind of flying that you do?
Because our flying is semi-infrequent, it works for us being once a month. I mean, there could be a month go by where we have 3 flights. So because of our infrequency, it's a lot of people know, oh yeah, I remember that flight, or
Gotcha.
It works for us.
And like you say, if they rung the bell and they submit a safety report, then they can document their thoughts right now anyway.
Yeah.
Yep. Gotcha. So just talk a little bit about what these guys see in the system to start their processing activity. A FOQA report in FOQA is going to look something like this, where they can see the tail, they can see their city pair and the times of their flights. Each event is organized into a well laid out card that they can see the GE assessment as well as the raw data off the QAR. So it really just helps them kind of see, what was it that occurred on this flight leg, and then from this be able to initiate their investigation with the pilot. So let's talk a little bit about the investigation piece. We'll start with you, Jonathan.
So the investigation, I mean, the safety report is the pilot side of the story. So like Eric was saying, if someone knows that they've either seen a hazard or they've created a thing, that's just the pilot side of the story, and it may be biased, it may be subjective, but the FOQA report is the aircraft side of the safety story, and it's not biased, it's very objective. But neither really tells the full story. The aircraft, the FOQA report, doesn't know what's going on outside of the cockpit, if there's demands from air traffic control, fatigue, other external things going into the flight. And then the FOQA report also, or a hazard report rather, coming from a pilot. Pilots may perceive things differently from each other, so they may have very different reports, where the objective FOQA report is just that, it's objective. It's doesn't really have any emotion in it. So when the pilots submit the report, and then I receive the FOQA report, I usually send, say the pilots have not submitted a hazard report or a safety report, they were not aware of the FOQA report, I'll share a PDF of the FOQA report with the pilots with a explanation that a FOQA report had been generated on a flight that they had been on, so they can kind of review the material themselves before we talk about it. And then the pilots and I will sit down together and discuss what caused, or what they think caused, or any external factors that went into the reason for the FOQA report.
Excellent. Eric?
So, as Jonathan said, the FOQA is just a data point collection. It's all of this provides information for the story. So the idea that the pilots are, they're given their side, the FOQA gives its side, and to reiterate that this is not always coming down to a single event of, oh, we had a TCAS RA, or had a wind shear event, or had a couple long landings. The point of it all is to track the trends. So if I can marry the safety report with the FOQA data and start to see, well, hang on a second, every time we start to go to this airport from the pilot side, we start seeing these numbers come out of the FOQA data. We can start to do a deep dive into trend analysis, not just singular event analysis. And that having the numbers from FOQA not only helps to come up with details to provide to the story, but it also, as aviation professionals, we love looking at data. So when I present it to the pilots and I say, here are the numbers, this is what happened, it creates a much more in-depth discussion about, oh, wow, I had no idea that was the actual number. I just knew it had happened, and things were happening so quickly afterwards that by the time I got to the hotel and wrote down my account of it, I forgot that little detail, or I didn't realize, how it came together as clearly as we can see it through the FOQA data.
Excellent. So again, the investigation being both what comes from the airplane and what comes from the pilot is good, because again, the more input you have, the more thorough your investigation can be, right? And then obviously from that, coming out other risk controls. A question I have around the investigations though is, when you first turned on your FOQA, what were some of the trends that you had that you initially saw? You're like, wow, I had no idea. And I guess we'll start with Eric.
Yeah, when we got ours started, we still had one Challenger 604, and we just acquired our first global. So the Challenger 604, but it was used to operating the aircraft. Suddenly this global comes along, and it's got much better landing performance, a lot slower airspeeds. I mean, it feels like you're landing a large 182. So when crews would get in the global, they'd get this sight picture of how it lands, and then they get in the Challenger 604 where it's approaching 10 to 15 knots faster, and it feels more like a lawn dart on its approach with a nose low attitude. The global also has a FADEC control engines, so once you touch down and you pull into reverse thrust, it automatically starts to decrease that reverse thrust to adhere to its own limitation. Whereas the Challenger 604 had a limitation of 60% N1 by 60 knots during the rollout. So guys would come in landing in the global, and everything's happening automatic. Suddenly they're flying the 604 and they're hauling into reverse, a lot past the 60 knot limitation, and not even realizing it. They're just feeling that anxiety of trying to slow down like the other aircraft does. So getting the FOQA data brought it to our attention, because crews didn't even realize they were doing it. There's no master caution, there's no master warning that you exceeded the 60 by 60 rule. So by bringing the FOQA to the table, as we were able to say was, I think this is why this is happening. I don't realize, none of us realize that we're doing it. So what can we do? What safety procedures can we put into place to help the situation? So as a department, we decided, well, during our slowdown, as we call 180, 60 knots, at the 80 knot call, that's our cue to start reducing the reverse thrust in the 604. Problem went away, and it was easy as having a discussion and modifying our SOPs. But the FOQA data is what brought it to the surface to begin with. Otherwise, we'd never known.
Yeah, great example. Jonathan.
When we first turned on FOQA, we found, so the Gulfstream 280 was first, we found that we had several incomplete flight control checks. So the FOQA data measures the full deflection of all the controls, and as it turned out, we had two pilots that were initially trained on it, and they went through the same training and were taught the same technique, and I said the kind of air quote on technique, on how to do a flight control check on that aircraft. And then the two other pilots, so we had four pilots total trained on it, went individually and had different flight instructors and learned different techniques for doing the flight control check. And you wouldn't think that doing something as simple as a flight control check would need that big of a technique, but because of the way it was taught, occasionally it was missed, and it was always the rudder, which was the last thing to be checked. And it was all pilots, all four of the pilots had at least one or two situations where they, or events where they had missed the flight control. So in looking at it, awareness was the first tool. We weren't aware of it until we saw in the FOQA. So we had a discussion about it and actually made a policy for the functional flight control check to do it the same for all pilots. And that way the pilot flying was doing the flight control check, and the pilot monitoring knew what he was looking for also, so that both pilots were engaged during the flight control check. So just a simple awareness tool, and then a policy fixed it, and we hadn't seen any since.
Right. And again, causal factor is interesting, right? Turns out it had three different instructors ultimately, which is kind of interesting.
Right.
Yep. Another question around investigation. Were there examples of where the FOQA data essentially affirmed trends that you were seeing in the safety data prior to the FOQA data? So we'll start with you, Jonathan.
Yes. On one of our aircraft, we were seeing reports from pilots saying that the auto throttle was malfunctioning on approaches, and primarily, or all the time, it was during a visual approach. A lot of the visual approaches, the only time that we use a visual approach are some of the airports that where it doesn't have an ILS, or the RNAV approach wasn't appropriate. So those airports in general are a little bit different operations anyways. I looked at the FOQA data, and I found that the reason for it was in the FOQA data was the pilots were setting the automation incorrectly for the approach, and they weren't aware of it. Basically, pilots were setting the missed approach altitude while they were on the visual approach, and it wasn't the vertical navigation wasn't engaged correctly for that, so that it would advance the thrust, and that's why they were doing it. So they were aware that it had a malfunction. It wasn't doing what they wanted, but they weren't certain why. We looked at the FOQA data after it came in, and then we were able to determine why.
All right, excellent. Eric?
So the other safety data trends, one that we learned about in the global was the 3-minute cool down prior to engine shutdown. The FOQA data monitors that, and discussions it had before FOQA of short taxis, allow the engine to cool down, because you land at Monterey and you could be in the blocks in a minute and a half, 2 minutes, and be sitting there running engines. But if you don't think about it and it doesn't come to your awareness, then you could shut down. It's a simple limitation, but one to keep it in front of our faces. Then with the global, it starts to monitor the time between wheels down and engine shutdown. So after seeing a few of these come through the FOQA, just brought it to the crew's attention through a read and acknowledge memo, and now people are checking the time, the touchdown time versus the GPS clock time, to allow that 3 minutes. It's just a simple change, and suddenly all that problem goes away. It was a real nice, easy fix.
Nice. All right, let's talk about some of the outcomes or risk controls based on what you learned. Kind of how did you then employ it? So let's start with an example from you, Eric.
So when we come up with something that is very specific to either an aircraft or an airport or a certain condition that they're going to encounter on future flights, I can create a flight risk trigger. Say, if you're in the Challenger, and you're going to Aspen, or if you're going international and you're coming into the US, it used to trigger the COVID restrictions. Suddenly they'd get an information block that says international arrivals, follow these procedures for COVID. Or I see you're going into Napa. We've had several TCAS RAs into Napa. Keep your head up. So having the ability to create flight risk triggers as part of our risk assessment for each flight has been very helpful, and crews know that when they see that trigger come through, it's because of an event in the past, as something has prompted that attention. It's been extremely helpful.
Right. And Jonathan?
So I'm going to go off script for just a little bit, Steve.
Yeah.
I'll give 2 examples. On the previous one with the auto throttle on the visual, once we figured out why, we sent out a memo to the crews, kind of as a lesson learned. And then also, because I was aware of it and I was on that aircraft, I talked to one of the designated examiners at our training provider about it, because that aspect of the automation really wasn't trained or wasn't talked about in the initial class. And I thought it was, if we were seeing it, that probably other crews were able to. So I was able to share that information with the training provider, that an emphasis needed to be taught on initial about that situation.
That's a good example of sharing outside your own flight department. Well done.
Right. And then we go into a mountain airport that has, it's a shorter runway, it's narrow, and I saw a couple of instances where people were landing what came up as a short landing. Initially, I thought that guys were landing intentionally landing short because it was a short runway. And then looking at I put in a corrective action and it didn't have the desired results. I was still seeing it, so I had to go back and I guess we'll talk about assurance on the next slide. But I found that when looking at it a little bit closer, that the precision approach path indicator guides the aircraft on that runway to land or to cross the threshold at only 25 feet, and that the PAPI for that runway, that mountain runway, is positioned about 400 feet beyond the threshold, not the typical 1,000 feet mark that you would expect for a precision approach path. So when I figured that out and talked about the crews about it, because they were saying they were right on the PAPI, and I was like, well, you know, you were landing short. We came up with a rule set that we built into our flight risk assessments, that each time the pilots are dispatched to go to that airport and their flight risk assessment, it comes up to caution that there is that the PAPI may lead to a shorter landing than desired. So that was one of the risk control, or an example of risk control we set up for that mountain airport.
Right, but that's a great example of what you, and I'm sure Eric does as well, is you take the initial input that you get and you go the extra mile to go do some extra homework on an airport, its runways and its PAPI, for example, and then do that extra level of depth on the investigation to come up with what ultimately ends up being a good solution. So again, back to the people process, right? Just getting the data is just the start of the process. It's what you then do with it, which yields all the great information. So that's a real good example. Some other ones here. Eric talked about the one in Aspen a little bit further.
Yeah, so when we initialized our FOQA program, one of the other things that we saw was on a particular flight into Aspen, the crews were held high by Denver Center and were given a slam dunk into the approach. Well, the approach starts at 14,000 feet. And when the max altitude is 15.5 for the flaps on the Challenger, and if you exceed it, there is no master caution, master warning to let you know that, hey, you were at 15.7, I think it was 15.7 or 15.8, that the crews added the flaps in an effort to, like I say, slow down and get down. They didn't even realize that it happened. So when the FOQA data caught it, we created a flight risk trigger that says if you're taking the Challenger into Aspen, it's going to trigger a flight risk information block or yield that says, be aware the max altitude is 15.5. And this is one of the only airports that we would encounter this particular limitation anyway. Everything else is near, much lower altitudes. And it just bringing it to their awareness every time that flight had been planned, it triggered that note, knowing that every time the Challenger goes into Aspen, the crews are going to be reminded about that if they complete their risk assessments. And the other one in the previous slide talked about, occasionally you get the jip whiz horn if you're descending visually into Aspen. So we just made a blanket rule that says if you always follow the approach profile, you'll never trigger the horn. So we just, again, the flight risk trigger comes up, you're going into Aspen, make sure you're following the approach profile. Provides a consistent approach feeling for our passengers as well. It's always the same.
Right, and they're getting it right before flight time, so they're dialed in right before they're about to take off of that particular flight.
It brought the important stuff right to the surface.
Yeah, exactly. And Jonathan, you got another couple examples.
Yeah, going into Scottsdale, it's we're seeing a high rate of unstable approaches going in there. So I reached out to Shelby at GE and asked them for some information about aggregate data about approaches going into Scottsdale, the stable versus unstable, and he was able to share with me a screenshot of all the stable and unstable approaches going in there, and a preferred approach path. We were able to see, all the, we'll call them the stable approaches, the path that they took to make sure that it was a stable approach. So with that information about working with them to figure out the best way to get to the stable approach there at Scottsdale, I published a lesson learned in our safety management system in the Vocus SMS.
And then you get your Mountainous Airport example.
Yeah. Same thing with going into the Mountainous Airport that I spoke about earlier. It's only a circling approach going in there. So going in on a visual flight, visual approach in there, we set up a kind of a standard approach profile for our flight department to make sure that we were landing or making the approach as stable as we could. Like I said earlier, we were seeing a couple of those short landings there because of the PAPI location. So the same thing, we lesson learned going into the safety management system, and then also in our flight risk assessment tool and flight risk, we set a reminder that would come up for every flight dispatched in there as a caution about the position of the PAPI and that it could lead you to a short landing.
These are great, specific examples, but the kinds of things that you could get from any kind of data that you get on any of the flights. So it's really good examples, guys.
In addition to that, one thing that you pointed out before, you can share these risk assessments with each other. So when his FOQA program produces information about Deer Lodge, we've started going in there in the past few years as well. Occasionally, I can just integrate that information into our system to bring the same notices to the pilot's forefront and combine it with our own experiences going in there, such as to plan your alternates. If the wind is, if the weather is going to be low and the wind is out of the east, go to Butte because the ILS lands east. If it's out of the west, go to Helena for your alternate because the ILS lands west. Those things are really important to be able to share with each other because we're all trying to create a safety culture in the same manner, and we can use each other to help lift up areas that maybe we haven't seen yet, and we're the FOQA data isn't what triggered it. It's, hey, learn it from somebody else's experience in there, and the system allows us to just to work together as a community instead of just a department.
Yeah, well said. Perfect. That's right. Awesome. Let's talk about safety assurance. Again, most of the time people think of safety assurance as just your audit program, but in reality, it's monitoring all of your risk controls, for effectiveness, right? So generically, this is neither Eric's data or Jonathan's data. It's just generically, I want to put a picture on the screen to make sure we're all understanding what we're going to talk about here. But basically, what are the kinds of events that you want to be tracking, right? Both gentlemen today have talked a little bit about trends and things that they're seeing. So this is the context that they're talking about. And like I said early on in today's presentation, we as an organization, we manage what we measure, right? So when you have an ability to measure these things through your SMS, then you have an ability to monitor it and ultimately make decisions that improve what you're expecting to see. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about that, and we'll start with Eric.
So when I see data come through the FOQA, I'll create a safety performance indicator to say, do I see a trend here? It can look back through all of the previous events and go, well, it occurred occasionally and I didn't catch it, but here are your events over the past year, to create some type of monitoring device that says, okay, is this a problem or is this a one-off? And then once I get the information together, I've got to read the tea leaves to say, is this a possibility of a safety problem in the future, and how do we be proactive about this? Then I can figure out how to communicate it to the crews, and we can start to brainstorm on what we're going to do to manage this problem moving forward, if it's even a problem yet. So the SPIs are important to keep track of that.
Yeah, and obviously, as you pointed out here, the SPIs are events per flight leg, so that just because you see an uptick in a certain SPI, putting it in the context of your flight leg, frequency is important, because SPIs might just go up simply because you've flown more. That doesn't mean it's happening more often. So having the rate is vital to understand the context of the increase that you may or may not be seeing, which is really important.
If we were getting charter type, flight frequencies, monitoring events per 1,000 might be more beneficial. But for us, we monitor, say, the last 5 flights into Aspen, somewhere specific, or the flights per month or per year, give us more insight into how things are going.
Yep. And I see here that you basically continue to monitor that SPI until it remains below the threshold, and sort of giving you that comfort that the controls are in fact working as you expect. Is that correct?
Yes. So once you've applied the fix, it's important to keep it. Is it working? So, and after a certain amount of time, you can't. I mean, monitoring it forever is, not always beneficial. But monitoring it for a specified amount of time. We're going to monitor this for the next year or the next 6 months. And if it stays below the threshold, we're taking it off the radar. And if it comes up again, fine. But that puts our focus back on what's important and not what happened in the past.
Exactly. And Jonathan.
So our SPIs are share the progress. Our Vocus SMS is used to set the SPIs, and we share our progress with the flight department. It's useful in determining if the corrective actions are meeting the intended goals. Like Eric said, you set a goal and or you set a corrective action, and then you track it to make sure that it has the intended purpose. And if it doesn't, then you go back and you create another corrective action to see if, well, you investigate, and then you set more corrective action plans to see if you can do it. As an example, long landings, we had a rash of long landings on longer runways, not necessarily a threat, because on 11,000 foot long runway, if pilots are trying to eke it on to get that really soft landing, they still have 8,000 feet of runway after they touch, or 9,000 feet of runway to slow down to get off. But the threat of that is they get a sight picture in their mind, or they get a muscle memory for touchdown that's not in a threshold all the time. So when they're on a 5,000 foot long runway, that's where the risk becomes, or where the risk is. So we identify that, we tracked it, we would notify pilots about it just to as an awareness tool. And the corrective action wasn't really anything except for awareness, to let pilots know that they were aware of it. Just to normalize the landings was the goal, and make sure that they were in the touchdown zones. When we look at our SPIs for other events, they can be tricky to set for what the threshold is going to be. We'll see in GE's reports and the FOQA reports, if you dig into them, it'll tell you what a baseline for the event is. It may be an acceptable rate. They may say 5 within 100 flights. Like Eric was saying, they don't fly 100 flights a month, so they probably don't generate that many reports. And we may only generate half of that. So you can look at the standard deviation if you dig a little deeper into the reports and see what a level 1 standard deviation is, or what a level 2 standard deviation is, and you set that for our goal, because we always want to. We accept that there's going to be some slips or deviations from what you expect, but you want to set your goal or your SPI realistic to what your level is, with the base being what GE says is the base, probably being the top level of that. So we would, if our deviation is a 3 and the FOQA report says the baseline would be a 5, we would use our SPI as 3 for tracking it, rather than the more frequent 5.
Gotcha. Excellent. And then promotion, you guys have both elaborated a couple times now on some of the examples, the ways in which you've communicated, but let's just kind of recap for the audience today. So Jonathan, why don't we start with you?
So as far as promotion, we do share the quarterly report for our department, and that kind of compares us to our peer groups. So I share that, and then during quarterly meetings, I outline where we've made improvements. We look at the SPIs frequently, because it's on our dashboard. But then we look at where we're making our improvements, and then conversely, where we need to focus our attention if we're not making our goal within our SPIs. Then the FOQA data is also used in the safety committee to address the events. I redact it unless it's necessary to share crew members. And then the potential causes for it, once we've done an investigation with the pilots and myself and the FOQA data. And then as a group within the safety committee, we come up with our corrective action plan. We share the lessons learned through the reports. So once we've come up with corrective action plan, we share that information either through memo or through lesson learned within our safety management system with the pilots, just so they can look back on it, and that's their way of kind of reading the corrective action plan. And where corrective actions require new policies, we'll come up with those policies and implement them into our flight operation manual. And whenever that's done, we use the acknowledgements within the safety management system to ensure that all the pilots have read the new policy or procedure, and that's our way of tracking to make sure that everyone's kind of working from the same set of rules. Mm-hmm. And then also for promotion, the flight risk assessment tool that we use, the flight risk through Focus SMS. I can create rules for specific airports or specific situations, flights that pilots will see either as a caution, a warning, or a stop, if you will, to make sure that the corrective action is done, to where pilots are aware. The awareness is there for each individual flight.
Excellent. And Eric, you're kind of similar. Go ahead, describe what you guys do.
Yeah, so once we identify what the hazard is and how do we want to integrate it into our operation, I try to take an approach to say that, if we end up with pilot turnover down the future and you get somebody new on the line, you don't want to basically hand them a stack of papers and say, please read all these risk reports for over the past 7 years and everything that everyone's learned and apply it to your operation immediately. So how do I bring it into the mix to say this is currently what we're doing and it's in one place and it's not overly stacked, because after a while things will get forgotten. So one thing we can do, we can write a memo to the crews. We have a annual safety meeting, quarterly safety meeting among managers, but an annual safety meeting where I'll bring in, this is what we've been monitoring this past year. Here's how we've been doing. These things are falling off, and bring everybody up to speed as to where we're at in the mix. If it's a permanent change to our operation, I'll include it in the next operations manual revision. I can create, as Jonathan said, a flight risk trigger. So everybody that's going into that airport is going to get the same information put in front of them every time they plan it to say, when you're going in here, be aware of this. We've seen this issue in the past. And having the Focus SMS platform as a read and acknowledgement tool has been very helpful as well, where it's not a text I'm sending out going, hey, you remember that text I sent you, 2 years ago about this problem? The read and acknowledgements are always there, and it links them to the memo that brought it to the attention. And if that memo is included into the FOM, eventually it falls away and we just have a new policy, such as the one we made for the SOPs that went straight into the SOP. Then the memo fell off and said, well, this is just how we do it now. So someone new comes in, they read the SOPs. Oh, there's an AD not call out. Great, that it prompts me to reduce the TRs.
Yeah. And you capturing your lesson learned in the flight risk rule really helps that new pilot, right? Because then they don't have to go hopefully read Encyclopedia Britannica before they start flying for you. They have those things pop up.
Right, as we talked about before, the flight risk assessments, you want the tribal knowledge that you've accumulated over time to be just as accessible to the brand new pilot as to the 30-year veteran. And they're applying the same techniques, the same things that have been learned, because they can't know it all, but when the moment comes in, it's put right in front of their face what we've learned about it, and they can operate with the same level of safety then.
Excellent. Okay, so one of the things I want to talk about again, and it ties to the promotion, and again, I think this is not Jonathan or Eric's data, but it's another client of mine who was willing to share some information. But I think I wanted to show this because I think Eric and Jonathan can elaborate that when you communicate and you promote your data, just having it in words often doesn't quite create the same impact. Whereas when you have a picture, it's, the old saying is it's worth 1,000 words. So an example that I'm showing on the screen here is, the number of events are happening over time. You can see it climbing on the left, and the yellow arrow there lays out the point in time when there was sort of a retraining of the pilot group around a particular thing. In this case, it was flight control checks. And from the moment you then have that corrective action put in place, you can see that the chart stops going up, it becomes flat. And I think when you start to show these things in this way, it just tends to stick and make people appreciate the success that you're having based on the work that you're putting into this whole process. So maybe Jonathan or Eric, if you could touch on same feeling as what you're seeing. Is this the way you do it too in your memos, or how do you go about it?
These trends are invaluable for communicating to the crews, because when you put hard data in front of pilots, they look and they study. When you're just telling them, hey, I'm noticing all you guys are doing this, you start to get a few eye rolls. You say, well, I think it, you start to get a little bit of skepticism. But when the data is right in front of them, they go, oh yeah, I see what's happening, and great, we've been doing much better with it. It's very effective.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. But on both sides of it, if you're first seeing a change where the rate's going the wrong direction, to what Eric was saying, that's an eye-opening picture for our pilots. But then also with the corrective action, if you see it like on the rate versus goal, you see it come down, that's pretty eye-opening that that corrective action worked, and whatever, if it's a policy or procedure, it got the intended goal.
Yep. And have you seen a evolution in the willingness of engagement because of this feedback? Oh, this system's working, it's doing these things. Do you guys sense that?
I think so, yes.
I get a much better response from the group when I have data to present instead of just the story.
Exactly. And I think that really ties to the message here that we like to propose. Again, people, process, and technology, right? It's the right information to the right people at the right time, and ultimately you guys making better decisions to fly safer, right? It's not just about being compliant, right? It's about flying as safely as possible. And we put all these moving pieces together in the right way, you can really make that happen, and with not a lot of extra effort. Although Eric and Jonathan, I'm sure you spend a lot of time processing things here. So parting thoughts. Again, I think from my perspective, SMS effectiveness really relies on the good data input. It's important that you have all sorts of input from your pilots directly through hazard reporting, or if you add on your FOQA FDM, it's going to supplement that and add to it considerably, as we've heard today. Again, it's very important to take away that FOQA FDM data is objective, and it supplements the subjective reports. And I think Jonathan had a pretty good talk track earlier about how the differences between the two and the importance of making sure you get both to really understand what's going on. It's also important to understand that the FOQA FDM data is the what happened, but you still need to do your SMS process to determine why it happened, right? Because it's the whys that are going to uncover those causal factors that then give you the basis for coming up with corrective actions and risk controls. Lessons learned, obviously lessons learned are most valuable when they're put in use at a very proactive time in the next flight sequence, right? I think, Eric, I loved your comment about asking a brand new pilot to read 68 documents before they start flying for you. The chances of that happening are somewhere between slim to none to winning the lottery. So being able to leverage technology again to like flight risk, to be able to, right before that flight where similar conditions exist, give them that very explicit, here's what we've learned in the past, just really gets them up the learning curve very quickly. And then effectiveness is, again, maximized by people, process, and technology. Again, I like to hammer that message home, and I think a lot of what Jonathan and Eric today really show you the amount of effort that they put into it, the way in which they communicate to their team, the process they use, and then the way they leverage technology to make it palatable to everybody and make it as easy as possible for them as well, or else the whole thing falls apart, right? And then last but not least, what's most important here is that we manage what we measure. And as you saw in the last couple slides about SPIs in particular, if you're seeing these trends, it's very tangible to be able to then communicate, then to be able to show on the other side of the time you put the corrective action in place that, hey, it's working, right? We're doing good things because we're doing the right things. And I think that's important. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Catherine, and open up the questions.
All right. Thank you, Steve, Jonathan, Eric. This is fantastic. And yes, you had me belly laughing with the have you read everything for the last 7 years and would you apply that immediately? That was an awesome, awesome moment for me in this fantastic and really just so informative in terms of all the things you've been discussing. There have been some real life questions here, and one of them is a safety director, Rachel, asked saying that, Jonathan, you brought up a lot of the same events we see in our flight data monitoring program, so I think you all hit a lot of the correct and frequently seen elements going on in the world, and asked about sharing contact info for an offline FOQA discussion. So I just wanted to point out to everyone that we've got Steve's email up here, and you're welcome to contact Steve directly, and then he can filter out the emails to the correct direction there. So thanks for asking about that. And Steve, any other thoughts on that?
No, that's exactly right. Just say, if you want to connect with Eric or Jonathan, let me know, and I'll make sure it gets to the gentleman.
Perfect, thank you. Another question that came in, if you create a lesson learned from a safety report or FOQA data event, will that lesson learned be a part or be included in the flight risk analysis on future trips into that airport, or do you also need to create a flight risk trigger for that information to be in the flight risk analysis report? That sounds FOCUS specific, but.
Yes, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but the lesson learned is a report that kind of like a memo, and then the flight risk assessment tool is a trigger that would have to be separate for the airport specific,
right?
Or event specific, rather.
Right, but then the lesson learned content, in other words, what you expect future pilots to be able to do about this issue, is then the content that gets put in the advisory when that rule triggers. So,
yes.
So there is a second step, but it's the same content. It's just a formalization in a lesson learned document, followed by the manifestation of that knowledge into the rule. Hope that answered the question.
Great, thank you. Another question, there are airports where VGSI and electronic glide slope are not coincident. How do you, quote, disentangle those from intentional deviations below glide slope?
Wow.
Yeah, that's what I said.
So
what I found
on the specific one that I mentioned, the mountain airport, that is, I use the HUD, and my suggestion on the flight risk assessment tool, the rule or the lesson learned from it, is to use the HUD with the flight path vector for your touchdown zone rather than following the PAPI, because the PAPI guides you to a short landing.
Okay, thank you.
And what we've seen too is that GE produces the information. It's non-subjective, so it's going to trigger each time it goes in there. So as the gatekeeper, it's my job to look at that data and go, is this a real problem, or is it just getting triggered? For instance, for us, we get triggers of that we turned final inside the final approach fix on the ILS. Well, it was a visual approach. Our manual says stable by 500 feet. And they were using the visual backed up with the ILS. So while the ILS was tuned in, they did turn inside the final approach fix in perfect adherence with our SOPs. It just triggered the warning. But as the gatekeeper, it's my job to look at that and go, I know what the situation was, archive that, and moving on.
Yep.
A fantastic way of addressing what you said about FOQA being the aircraft story and SMS being the pilot story, and that the objectivity and subjectivity, and that it's your that the goal there is to put those together. That's just such an elegant way to address that kind of information and deal with it according to your organization and what your goals are. Okay, another question. This is VOCUS specific as well. If a VOCUS user creates a yield or a stop for a particular airport, do all VOCUS users see that stop or yield if they're going to that airport?
No, the rules are unique to each customer. So the rules that Eric and Jonathan were elaborating on today are things that they have built explicitly for their flight department based on what they're learning out in the field as they fly. There is an option, however, that when you do build a rule and you feel that rule would be helpful to others flying in a particular airport or particular conditions or whatever, you can, quote unquote, opt into sharing your rules. And those rules are then available to all of the VOCUS clients to be able to consume and reuse. And when they do opt into sharing rules, they do sort of redact it to make sure there's nothing sensitive to their company, people's names, any of that stuff. They take out anything that's unique to them, and they leave sort of the fundamentals of what it is they learned. And then that rule can be used by all VOCUS clients. So, but the default is that rules are just for your organization to start. You decide whether you want to share them more broadly, kind of like what Eric was alluding to earlier.
Mm-hmm. And if I want to adopt a rule, I can go into the VOCUS rule sets and search for rules. Hey, anybody know anything about going into Hebronville, Texas? And suddenly I'll see in there, oh, we have an information block going in there. Bring your own chalks. Stay in Laredo. The FBO isn't fully attended. Here's the gate code. Stuff like that that we can share with the group as a flight risk assessment trigger. But sharing that information with the community is not automatic.
But I think, like Eric, I think you said it very eloquently earlier, is that, there's so much great information that you learn to make your own flight department safe. To the extent we are willing to expose that information to more people, then that has broader benefits, right? So again, none of us really compete on safety, right? You hate to think that people are hoarding safety information. So to the extent you can share, it does take a little extra effort, but certainly it's great and valuable for others to learn from, especially if you've never been to that airport before.
Right.
Along the lines of continuous communication for continuous improvement, another question is, have you found that sharing FOQA insights is enhancing the openness in your pilot camaraderie and culture?
We have. When I was a pilot and not being a safety manager, what I knew about safety management system, I didn't even know what that flight operations quality assurance I didn't know what FOQA was. I knew that I was supposed to do risk assessments every flight, and I knew I was supposed to make risk reports when I saw something that was dangerous. I didn't know how fast the duck feet were moving onto the water or what was going on behind the scenes. And to be able to get buy-in from your crews is to project that I'm not here to be big brother watching your every move and want to shake my finger and have you confess to every mistake you ever make. The point here is to try and look forward as to what could happen. We could have FOD damage by pulling TRs too deep into the landing roll on the Challenger. So, hey everybody, I'm noticing this. To say that you're monitoring for the good of the entire community or the good of your company gets you more buy-in. And having that FOQA data to show hard numbers to them, saying, look, this is what I'm seeing, gets better buy-in from the crews, rather than just saying, hey, I've noticed I flew with you the other day and man, you had a long landing, what's going on? Versus I'm saying, I see long landings coming through the FOQA, what's happening? Oh, we're trying to touch down soft. Great, well, that's not going to work going into Van Nuys. You're gonna end up rolling it all the way to the end, and if you stop at the end, or things such as that. So having the FOQA data to back up the buy-in from the crews has been helpful.
Yeah, I found the buy-in is best when you can publish the results. So when you use the FOQA data to make a corrective action, and then they can see that it's got a positive effect on the result. So communication is key for the buy-in, not just the fact that we're using FOQA data, but then we can't silo the information. It can't go into the black hole of safety management. It needs to have the safety promotion aspect of it, to where they can see that we're not just monitoring, but we're monitoring and we're making changes that influence the safety and increase the safety.
Exactly. Good stuff.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question, and this flows, I think, from what you were just talking about. By adding FOQA data alongside employee self-reports, do you feel that your management looks at the safety, your safety performance indicators any differently, your SPIs?
I feel that it does. When I'm looking at safety performance indicators and I'm getting crew stories of saying, well, you know, the FOQA data presented that I was unstable. Well, it was extremely gusty that day, and we were, you know, on final approach, and the gust didn't warrant a go around, but it was just enough to trigger that unstable approach criteria. So I can put it into an understanding of, here's the pilot story. Yes, the FOQA data said this. Is it a real problem, or did it just barely tap, you know, ring the bell? And having that discretion really helps to feel like I'm not nitpicking crews and going, I only want to identify the safety problems. I don't want to harass people for a little nick here or there.
But in the same token, you're only aware of safety issues that you're aware of. A lot of times, if it's not reported as a safety report, because, okay, so safety reports should be preventative. They're pointing out a hazard that hasn't occurred yet, where a FOQA report would be a hazard that has occurred. So you have more data, and with more data, you can actually see where the safety performance indicators are. So I do think that we look at SPIs differently with FOQA because we have more to look at.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. We are out of time. Steve, I'd like to see if you have any parting thoughts before I finish here.
I just want to thank Eric and Jonathan for participating. Again, these guys are two pros, and they've got a lot of experience in SMS as well as FOQA, as I hope came across today, and a lot of great talking points here. And again, this will be the recording will be available, so if you want to go back over it or share it. The goal here for these things is to take information back to your flight departments to help you sell the next advancement for your flight department to your management team. So hopefully the examples that Eric and Jonathan have given you today, as one of the questions articulated, is what they see as well. So to be able to take the rest of the things that were presented today and say, hey, this is maybe where we can go with our flight department, is maybe helps you advance what you're trying to accomplish at your flight department.
Thank you so much, Steve, Jonathan, and Eric. Yeah, manage what you measure. What a great session this was, and lots of terrific information to take forward for everyone. As Steve mentioned, these are recorded and they will be available on the IBAC website, as well as, I am sure, the Polaris website. And so with that, I also want to point out that there is another SafetyNet session from Polaris Aero covering single aircraft operation and SMS as an enabler for your safety program versus a burden. The link is in the chat, in the question section for you if you'd like to register for that. I hope we see you there. And in the meantime, thank you, gentlemen, so much. This was a fabulous session, and we will be sharing this widely. So everyone, have a good day. Enjoy the beginning of the holiday season and fly safe. We'll see you at our next SafetyNet webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.